All right, I had a couple of questions this week about inheritance tax in Japan. And personally, I'm quite a fan of inheritance tax. I think it's socially desirable to prevent rich families from getting richer and richer and richer forever. But quite apart from that, regardless of how you feel about inheritance tax, it does exist. Japan does have inheritance tax, and you may have to pay it. So let's talk about it. There's lots of horror stories about Japan has 55% inheritance tax. They're going to steal all your money. And that's not quite true, I think. Let's go into the details in this short video. We've got a couple of articles on the blog. If you want some more detail, I'll link to those in the description. But otherwise, let's take a look at this. So, first of all, do you have to pay inheritance tax at all? So let's look at a couple of scenarios. So if the inheritance is in Japan, so somebody dies in Japan and they leave you some money and you also live in Japan, then yes, you have to pay inheritance tax. Or rather, you're potentially liable for inheritance tax. So if the inheritance is large enough, you may have to pay inheritance tax on that. If the inheritance is not large enough to pay tax on, you don't have to report it. There's nothing that you need to do. So that's first scenario. If the inheritance is abroad, so someone dies in another country and the assets are in another country, so maybe there's a house, maybe there's some money, some investments, and so on, and you live in Japan, then you may be liable for inheritance tax. We're going to talk about that on the next slide. If the inheritance is in Japan, so someone dies in Japan and you are not in Japan and you inherit some of the assets, if those assets are in Japan, then Japanese inheritance tax is due. If the assets are not in Japan, then it might not be. So that's worth looking into. So this is the second scenario here. So the inheritance is not in Japan and you live in Japan. Do you have to pay tax? There's a maybe here. These are the more specifics there. So if you have a work visa and you've been in Japan for less than 10 years, you don't have to pay Japanese tax on your inheritance, regardless of how large it is. This was changed to make Japan more attractive for foreign workers, basically. So if you came here for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, and something happened and you received an inheritance, then obviously if Japan could tax that, that would be fairly unattractive. So under the current rules, as long as you're on a working visa and you've been here less than 10 years, you don't owe tax on inheritances abroad. Now, if you're on a working visa and you've been here more than 10 years, you do owe Japanese inheritance tax on your inheritance. Basically, once you've been here for 10 years, you pretty much live here, so you're bound by the same rules as everyone else. Now, if you have a spouse visa or you're a permanent resident, doesn't matter how long you've been in Japan, you are liable for Japanese inheritance tax. So that is potentially quite a big factor if you're thinking about getting a spouse visa rather than a working visa, if you're thinking about getting permanent residence. So be aware that that immediately puts you in the liable for inheritance tax group. Now, this is how Japan calculates inheritance tax. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. There's more info on the blog, and there's a lot of information out there if you want to look for it. But basically, what you do is you calculate the value of the estate, so the assets that are left in the inheritance. And then there's a basic deduction, and this is based on the number of people involved, the number of legal heirs. And you take away that deduction, and then you figure out the share of the inheritance that each person gets. This is either done according to the standard split in Japan, which is half to the spouse, and then the remaining half is split between the children. And there's a bunch of different scenarios if there's no children or if there's no spouse and so on. And then you apply a tax rate to that, and then each person, and then you calculate how much tax is due, and then each person is responsible for paying their own share of that tax. So how much is this deduction? So it depends on the number of legal heirs. So that's people like spouses, children, siblings, etc. And if there's one person, so the standard deduction is 30 million. If there's no legal heirs, there's only yeah, there's no spouse, no children, no relatives, basically, the standard deduction is 30 million yen. So the first 30 million yen of the inheritance is not taxed. If there's one heir, it's 36 million. Basically, each extra heir adds an extra 6 million yen to the tax-free deduction here. So if you had a spouse and 3 children, that's 4 legal heirs. 54 million yen of the inheritance would be tax-free, and only the amount above that would begin to be taxed. And so, because of this, something like 90 some percent of estates in Japan are not taxed at all. So they're not liable for inheritance tax. They're not large enough to get over this threshold. And these are the actual inheritance tax rates. So much like income tax, inheritance tax goes in bands. So the first 10 million yen is taxed at 10%, and that's after deducting the tax-free amount. So, in the case of that spouse and 3 children, 50, what was it? Let's pop back. So, 54 million yen was tax-free. So the next 10 million yen, assuming there was 64 million yen in the inheritance, will be taxed at 10%. The next 30 million yen is taxed at 15. The next 50 million yen at 20, and so on. And only when we get over 600 million yen is the portion above that amount taxed at 55%. So yes, Japan has a 55% inheritance tax rate, but it only applies to estates that are over 650 million yen. So yeah, unless you're a billionaire, you're not going to be paying anywhere near 55% on the amount you inherit from the estate. There is a lot of extra detail in here. For example, a spouse has a 160 million yen tax-free deduction available to them. So for the spouse, they're generally not going to be paying a lot of tax on inheritances and so on. There's lots of details. If you're going to have an inheritance, if you've had an inheritance, definitely recommend talking to a specialist, especially if it's a larger inheritance. If you're expecting a larger inheritance, do keep this in mind, especially if you're from a country like Australia or the US. Australia doesn't have inheritance tax, and the US has $12 million is tax free. So if you're expecting a larger inheritance from one of those countries, you might want to reconsider your Japanese residence, how much difference that's going to make to your decision. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.